You are listening to a Roamcast with Neil Kramer.
We're all involved in this together. Whatever you do affects all of us.
You mind your business and I'll mind mine. And keep right out of my affairs, or else you'll be in real trouble.
Yeah, we don't want to do anything to scare your children. That's the last thing we want to do. We don't want to scare anybody.
To perceive clearly, to grasp meaning, you need to be able to separate one thing from another. It is one of the basic spiritual responsibilities to exercise our capacity for discernment. I think we have an obligation to make the time and make the effort to differentiate, to distinguish, to discern reality as best we can. The word discern, from the Latin discernere, to separate, to set apart, to divide, to perceive. From the root word cernere, separate, sift, distinguish, choose. Separation lies at the heart of discernment. One of the best illustrations of separation in action, physically and practically speaking, can be seen in the process of distillation. In basic laboratory terms, distillation is the process of separating out the component substances of a mixture. That is, two or more chemically discrete substances. The separation process is accomplished by way of the selective heating of the mixture and then condensing the resultant vapours into a container. For example, a glass of salty water can be distilled to produce pure drinkable water. It's a relatively straightforward process. The salt solution is placed into a flask and heated until it boils. The heat transforms the water into vapour, of course, and the salt stays behind in the flask. The water vapour then passes into a condenser, which is just a tube surrounded by a layer of cold water, which cools the steam and turns it back into a liquid. And finally, you have a distillate of pure water. You have separated one thing from another. You can do this with simple mixtures with just a couple of components, or complex mixtures with lots of different things within them. But the principle is the same. You heat it, change its state to vapor in this case, and then condense that down into liquid. What's this got to do with anything? You might well be asking yourself. Well, for our purposes, what I want to draw your attention to is the heating part of the distillation process, which is sometimes more formally called volatilization. To volatilize something is to upset it, to put it into a state of discomposure, to agitate, to excite, to provoke, to disrupt. It is this volatile discomposure that initiates transformation. It changes the state of a thing. The volatility is what makes the transformation and separation and purification happen. It is refinement through identifying and extracting essence. It gives the power to recognize what is valuable and what is not. Now hold that principle of distillation in your mind for a moment. Think about applying that to people, to their knowledge and perceptions, their feelings and beliefs. Think about discernment. Think about how that affects whole cultures and societies. Is the distillation method applicable to human beings? Is there a necessity for volatilization to catalyze transformation and discernment? Are they intimately linked? Does the distillate of truth permanently change a person? Could it possibly be that all this social breakdown and all this unsettling discomposure we see in the world is actually all happening for a good reason? And what we're witnessing is a mass-scale distillation, happening by way of a grand volatilization. I think the world is being brought carefully to its boiling point, so as to unveil the monumental separation between good and evil. So we can see them very clearly in these last days. It's a gift. We can see what distinguishes one from another. This most profound and classical polarity of all polarities, good and evil. It all stems from that. All the combinations come from that. Moral, immoral, sacred, profane, real, unreal, pure, poison. All of it. All now being uncovered in an explicitly theatrical fashion, sometimes exquisite, sometimes macabre, so that it cannot in any way be missed. Massive divine distillation. This sad world is dissolving for a reason. Not for nothing into oblivion. On the contrary, so as to illuminate the free will consequences of good and evil choices. Thousands of years ago, the Canaanites killed babies, taught sexual perversion to children, mutilated children's bodies, enslaved children for sex and work, and sacrificed them to demons. Today, institutions in America, Canada, Britain, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Asia, Africa continue these practices, unabated, unashamed. They just call them something else now. They have a new set of terminology, don't they? Reproductive rights, sexual inclusivity in schools, gender reassignment surgery, minor attracted sex, underage trafficking. Sounds a bit nicer that way, but it's the same thing. Evil. We must distinguish between sacredness and depravity. The only way a person can do evil is by doing away with God. If there's no God, they can do whatever they like, and whatever anyone else does is okay too. Everything is okay. It's all good. Evil is good. When you do away with God, evil is good. No need for distillation or any of that upsetting volatility. Just do evil, and everything is just a whole lot easier. Let's look at it the other way around. Can you imagine a society where relationships are sacred? Where sex is sacred? A hallowed and wonderful thing. Where sexual intimacy is the sole province of deep communion between an adult man and an adult woman who willingly devote their whole lives together in God's eyes. Deep, vast empathy. Sensitively nurtured over years and years. the divine image of a man and a woman learning real unity in profound spiritual, mental, emotional, and sexual intimacy. Exciting, enriching, healing, beautiful, fulfilling, integrating, connecting, loving. This is goodness. We can distill. We can separate one way of life from another. We can choose. The world will not judge you, but God will. God is doing something here. He's not just letting the world run away with itself into pandemonium. That's not how it works. He is meticulously tending the world to provide every possible opportunity for someone to choose goodness. The spiritual beings that comprise God's celestial host are deeply involved in this. Large numbers of them here now, from day one, still here now with us. People's brains would melt if they knew the glorious truth of it all. And even at the ground level, mankind is also doing something. Millions of good people are helping too. But the real doing is from the top down. Only what God does, only His will affects everything, everyone, everywhere, all the time. Mankind is not the agent of collapse in this world. That's important to remember. The world is being purposefully volatilized by God to give every opportunity, as we say, for mankind to see good and evil and make free will choices. The world is then totally disintegrated, every piece of it gone forever. And a new earth is made in a higher realm, pristine, timeless, whole, depolarized, no decay, no corruption. A world made for all humans who, even in the prior fallen earth, intrinsically and unwaveringly valued truth and divinity over themselves. Even when the culture taught them to walk selfishly and hide in illusions. God is bending over backwards to help us, to give us our real home world. And He has been doing this from day one. Literally, day one. In this day, today, it is important, I think, to realise that no matter what political stuff goes on, no matter what wars, what pestilence, what phenomena, what disclosures, secrets, aliens, devils, dramas, threats, spectacles, ultra-hyped theatrics, no matter what manner of flustering oddities spew out, it's all part of the education in good and evil. With some careful distillation, you will see that this crazy auditorium is bursting with priceless spiritual wisdom. Every day is brimming with celestial typology and redemption. God made it all. He constructed every square inch of it, and He put life into it. And He gave that life, angels and humans, the incredible gift of free will. Sadly, many of them abused that privilege, which is why, as we keep saying, the world is so bloody awful. The Satan adversary was self-chosen among this number to demonstrate and focus the evil consequences of envy and conceit. His selfish illusions are the same ones humans have. I know better than God. So God allowed fallenness to happen, so we can see the differences between self-authority and God's authority. We are not here to enjoy ourselves and just do our own thing. We are here to get educated, get with God, get straight, and go home. You don't have to do these things. If you don't want to get educated, you don't want to get straight, and you think you don't need God because you're already okay in yourself, fine. Your innate power of free will gives you the liberty to think whatever you like. Though God has cautioned us that that sort of thinking will see such a person go down big time. Go down with this vaporizing rock, along with a lot of other folk who think they knew best. Fallen watchers, false prophets, proud antichrists, scavenging demons. This is how important your choices are. Every ordinary, normal, uneventful, monochromatic day. What you choose means everything. Right things you could think and do. Wrong things you could think and do. Things no one would ever see. No one would ever know. Why bother thinking if no one ever need know about it? Because our thoughts are, of course, totally secret and invisible. Except to the Creator. He sees it all, inside and out. Nothing is shrouded. And He particularly concerns Himself with your thoughts and feelings, your inner heart. If you stripped all this down to the absolute bare essentials, you could say, love the world or love God. People might not like to characterize it like that, but I think that's what it is. Christ Himself said, "Do you suppose that I came to grant peace on earth? I tell you, no, but rather division." And He explains in various places that that division is self-chosen, depending on a person's allegiance to either the physical world of self or the spiritual world of God. This being illustrated in divisions even amongst one's own family and friends, one's nearest and dearest. No one is exempted from choosing where they put their loving attention, where they put their care to know. Truth and divinity are absolutely synonymous with each other. Sacred and immaculate in their interlacing. Only He who has the power of true creation can know the fundamental truth of a thing. God knows all that He has made. He knows what everything is for and how it works. He alone knows why the world is the way it is, and why things proceed the way they do. The splendor, the love, the insurgence, the separation, the sorrow, the holy mystery, the mortality, the sanctification, the resurrection, the ascendance, the immortality, the new divine world. He knows it all. Complete omniscience. Everything absolutely comprehended, from start to finish. Whereas we know fuck all. Nevertheless, despite that, quite astonishingly, and with unfaltering loving kindness, the Creator is glad and ready to share His wisdom with us. To share His wisdom with anyone, in fact. Anyone who is able to demonstrate that they are soundly stewarding the wisdom He has already given them. If we are graceful and dignified custodians of this gift of knowing, He will endow us with greater insights. More knowledge, more wisdom, deeper vision, deeper empathy. All of which He encourages us to deploy with enormous liberty and creativity. If we operate in truth. On the other hand, if we do not steward His resources wisely and maturely, and instead just totally squander everything, then He withdraws. And our comprehension withers. Our care to inquire wanes. Even though everyone alive knows God, he allows us to ignore him. He allows us to denigrate him, and we are quite free to refute his very existence, if we so wish. And at that point, when someone goes that far, he is willing to leave us to our own devices, to go about the world as the hapless, misguided twits we are without him. Even though they knew God, they did not honour him as God, or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man. When a person hides from God, whatever their reasons might be, however hard they attempt to rewrite and reimagine things all on their own, their life will slide into fiction. It has to. Unhurriedly subsiding, quietly sinking into the reflex of not thinking and not feeling. I don't mean everyday mechanics of brushing your teeth, driving a car, giving someone a smile, sitting at a computer, talking on the phone. I don't mean that. I mean really thinking about life, about existence, really feeling it. Empire does everything in its power to promote the cessation of all that. It wants to make people think that it's the most normal thing in the world not to do those things. It is socially acceptable, normal, permissible, preferred. And instead, what they proffer is a life of imitation, to merely imitate love, imitate peace, imitate joy, imitate thinking, imitate satisfaction. A life of displacement. Displacing God, displacing Christ, displacing Spirit, displacing humility, displacing redemption, displacing ascension, and substituting them with the dust of the world. This is not a harmless fantasy lifestyle choice, because someone who perpetually breathes this fiction of imitation and displacement, they live in a desecrating paralysis. They poison themselves and everything they touch. To see this, to observe this behavior, does not constitute condemnation in any way, shape or form. No souls are harmed in thinking these thoughts. Condemnation is God's domain, and he does that impeccably, fiercely, justly. Our job is not to condemn souls. Our work is concerned with understanding souls, our own souls, the souls of our beloved, and the souls even of our enemies. Trying to figure out why people do what they do. Why choose evil when you don't have to? Why stop thinking when you need not? We have to observe this madness. We have to choose not to participate in it, not to repeat it, not teach it to our children, families, friends, communities. Christ said, "Do not judge according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgment." In other words, look carefully before you make a decision. Gauge wisely based on what is true and right. Perfectly natural for us to do that. We ought to do that. Judiciously, honourably. And of course, always balancing with the right proportions of tact, boldness, courage, composure in any given situation. When I see this fictional practice of imitation going on in the world, I certainly detect a few distinctly different styles of it, different modes of fiction, depending on the psychology, the traumas, the mentality of the various individuals. For sure, you can easily observe what we might call a relativist style of fiction. This is the fiction that pulls in all those people that we'd call woke, liberal, humanist, left-leaning, socialist, anti-truth, anti-judgment. People who replace the divine with the human, spirit with earth. And so you end up with all that destructive social reform and harmful environmentalism, racist identity politics, perverse sexuality, veneration of crap science. People just constantly bluffing, routinely passive-aggressive. Just bad vibes. You know, as they congregate in various health food stores and farmers markets and yoga studios and whatnot, for some reason. And they're also the first ones lining up to get vaccinated. They love the vaccinations. They love that. Even though, deep down, they know it's poison. They know it's fake. But that's not important to them. What matters is being part of the world-worshipping culture. There is also a syncretic style of fiction. This is the mode that attracts the New Agers, the Tibetan tea cozy merchants, phenomena junkies, lovers of miraculous cures, hodgepodge druids and forest smurfs. And as with all fictional styles, objective reality is not important. It's not important. Instead, it's all about adventure, mystery, and freedom, which ironically supplant the real odyssey of life, the actual divine mystery, and real spiritual liberty. They're often pleasant enough, yet also often accompanied by a little cloud of disarray. I've met a lot of these people, and as I say, some of them are really nice folks, kind, warm, intelligent people, but still totally preferring fiction over reality, and wanting to be part of a community with other people who also do that, who also decry reality. And the last style of fiction that I see is a decidedly cult fiction, which is how you end up with Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, Scientologists, the Children of God, the Family, the People's Temple, Heaven's Gate, the Moonies, Nexium, and so on. Lots of cults. So that's about 50 million people I've now offended. Sorry about that. It's not personal. Cult fiction promotes a sense of belonging over a sense of reality. Again, being part of something is more important than having the truth. And some cultists are born into it, sad. And some choose it as adults, which is sad. For some cultists, not all, but many, they are quite glad to have human authorities over them, to control every aspect of their lives. They don't have to think for themselves anymore. All of that stuff has been taken care of. And whenever I encounter cultists, which is not a ton, but when I do, I always feel a buried misery inside them, very faintly obscured by a pretend happiness. They're often amiable enough and everything, but as I say, just beneath the surface I can see this terrible distress. All three of these forms of fiction are just so damaging. They hurt people. They condition people to hurt themselves. And then you get hundreds of millions of adults freely choosing a self-harming way of life and teaching their children the same thing. So whether relativist, syncretic, cultist, these fictions all have one thing in common. They are all designed to conceal the reality of God. They replace the pursuit and contemplation of the Creator with something else. For the relativist, God is replaced by humanity and the earth. For the syncretic, God is replaced by spurious magical concepts anchored in self. For the cultist, God is deposed by fake human prophets under a fake God. It's just so cruel, the whole allure of these evil fictions. And there are some good people trapped in these things who don't know how to get out. And I pray to God that they find the strength and courage and support to do so, to get out. I think for an awful lot of them, though, these systems of fiction are freely chosen, freely adopted, freely maintained. I dare not think of the spiritual catastrophe that awaits these people on the last day. The people who choose it, as adults freely, the person who has displaced God of their own free, intelligent avowal, I wouldn't wish that fate on my worst enemy. The relationship between truth and God is one of the most important spiritual concepts I can think of. Over many years, I've come to recognize the reality that when you have a relationship with God, you have a relationship with truth. And if you only know God a little bit, then you will only know the truth a little bit. If you know God a lot, deeply, sincerely, for real, then you make yourself capable of knowing a great deal of truth. Truth does not change. It is not subject to the fluctuations of the flesh. It is already complete, pure, absolute. Only our perception or understanding of truth changes. Wisdom is knowing truth and understanding how to apply it, something we are all invited to partake in. In Proverbs chapter 8, wisdom itself speaks and makes an appeal to us. Let me read the passages to you. So this is Proverbs chapter 8, and we'll read from verse 12 onwards. I, wisdom, dwell with prudence, and I find knowledge and discretion. The fear of the Lord is to hate evil. Pride and arrogance and the evil way and the perverted mouth I hate. Counsel is mine, and sound wisdom. I am understanding. Power is mine. By me kings reign, and rulers decree justice. By me princes rule, and nobles who judge rightly. I love those who love me, and those who diligently seek me will find me. Riches and honor are with me, enduring wealth and righteousness. My fruit is better than gold, even pure gold, and my yield better than the choicest silver. I walk in the way of righteousness, in the midst of the paths of justice, to endow those who love me with wealth, that I may fill their treasuries. The Lord possessed me at the beginning of his way, before his works of old. From everlasting I was established, from the beginning, from the earliest times of the earth. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no springs abounding with water. Before the mountains were settled, before the hills, I was brought forth. While he had not yet made the earth and the fields, nor the first dust of the world. When he established the heavens, I was there. When he inscribed a circle on the face of the deep. When he made firm the skies above. When the springs of the deep became fixed. When he set for the sea its boundary, so that the water would not transgress his command. When he marked out the foundations of the earth, then I was beside him as a master workman. And I was daily his delight, rejoicing always before him, rejoicing in the world, his earth, and having my delight in the sons of men. Now therefore, O sons, listen to me, for blessed are those who keep my ways. Heed instruction and be wise, do not neglect it. Blessed is the man who listens to me, watching daily at my gates, waiting at my doorposts. For he who finds me finds life, and obtains favour from the Lord. But he who sins against me injures himself. All those who hate me love death. Can you feel the truth of it? Without God, without seeking him, without being close to his living wisdom, a person will find themselves unprepared and unwilling to care for truth. They're glad if it falls in their lap, but they won't pursue it. No interest, no appetite. It just doesn't matter. They feel that truth is hard, and it often is. It changes things, it does. It's full of sorrow, it is. So why bother with it? Why would I make my life more complicated and difficult by messing around with truth and wisdom and all that? In fact, wouldn't it be better if truth didn't exist? Well, you only need to make one small alteration to reality to achieve that. You just remove God, and truth disappears with him. To not care about truth is a fundamental form of vanity, a numbing self-idolatry. It's quite an amazing idea that God is truth. It is his very being. Like sunlight is from the sun, innately, uniquely. You only get sunlight from the sun. You can't get it from a flashlight, you can't get it from light bulbs, or LEDs, or computers. CGI can't produce it. It's not in paintings or photographs. It's not in candles, or volcanoes, or bonfires. The sun is the only source of sunlight. So it is with truth. God is the only source of truth. He constitutes it. He beams it freely outward. He decides it. Truth is his expression. Absolutely his expression. The gifted American lexicographer, Mr. Noah Webster, who we've talked about a few times before, in 1828 in his dictionary, he defined the word absolute as meaning free, quite independent of anything extraneous, complete in itself, existing perfectly objectively from anything else, not affected or limited by any external power or control, unmoved, unconditional, immutable. And this is the common sense logic that allows us to say with conviction that truth is absolute. And when you know that, it changes everything. Right from the depths of yourself, right out into the source of the universe. When you recognize absolute truth, you are now on duty. You are responsible. Your life is no longer your plaything. You can't make stuff up anymore. And in recognizing the necessity to live in a new way, you are forgiven your silliness. You are lifted, sanctified, justified. The Creator is with you. One need only admit the truth. The white, made by God's hand, is always white. The black is always indelibly black. Nothing else. But if a man wears rose-tinted spectacles, let's say, it may appear to him that the black is a sort of dark red, and that the white seems to be a pale rose colour, even though they are not. Yet he will swear they are, because that is what he is choosing to see through his tinted glasses. You can tell him the truth all you like. You can communicate with him skillfully and logically and kindly, and tell him that black is black and white is white. But he will contend until his last breath that his own experiential perceptions are king. He is the determiner of reality. There is no external truth for him, only subjective perception. For him, everything is rose-coloured, and that's the way he likes it. The lenses bring soothing dreams to him. The whole idea of good and evil is considered to be a mere fashion that ebbs and flows with the cultural tides of the day, in or out of vogue, like music or clothes or home decor. All talk of black is black and white is white is distasteful. And of course, none of that changes the reality that black remains intractably black, and white's whiteness is quite impervious to anyone's perceptions of it. The truth remains the same. All you can do is get closer to it or farther away from it. This reminds me, all this talk, of another question I sometimes get asked, which is, what do I think is the most important message to give to young people? Well, I'm not a parent, so I can't talk about all that in any great depth, frankly. But I do know one thing that is important for growing minds. So every time I do get asked that question, I tell them that to seek truth is one of the very best things you can do in life. I know that if kids, teenagers, 20-somethings, if they do indeed seek truth, genuinely, if they think about it and study it and discover it and contemplate it, learn to distinguish it, from untruth, if they really do that, then one day they will find themselves at the feet of the Creator. They will recognize His presence. His part in all of it becomes apparent. A person who approaches the idea of truth with a clean slate, with no bias, no agenda, just totally open and willing to endeavour to see what is true, they will see the connection between truth and divinity. So, if you're listening to this podcast and you have kids, inspire them to seek truth. What is it? How do you perceive it? And why does it matter? If they pursue this, they will equip themselves with a blade that pierces empire's dark illusions. A sword that will be at their side their whole life, and it'll help them to make better decisions, get with better people, get a sense of purpose, and get closer to God. What constitutes spiritual work? What are the most fundamental activities of spiritual life? It's a hell of a question, isn't it? So many things one could say here. 1,000 different practices, 1,000 philosophies. so many viewpoints, so many rituals, so many techniques. Surely there are just so many abstruse pathways that it might seem that spiritual work is just whatever we decide it is, right? What if, instead, the answer to our question, what is real spiritual work, has been provided? What if the central components that comprise spiritual focus have been quite nicely elucidated? And what if, more importantly, the source of that information was the most credible source in existence, which would be the Creator himself? The divine entity who once incarnated into a human form, the first and only time this has happened from scratch, that divine man gave us our answer from an enlightened, yet boots on the ground perspective. Wouldn't that be worth our serious consideration? There was a point in history where a Pharisee scribe and legal expert was testing Christ. And as you may know, Pharisees and Christ did not get along too well. In fact, Christ didn't really have a nice thing to say about the Pharisees, because they were essentially spiritual pretenders, and Christ was messing up their monopoly on religious life. He was a growing threat to their authority, because he was, and remains, an intrinsically countercultural figure, as indeed are all those who follow him today. So these guys didn't see eye to eye. So the Pharisee was trying to test Christ, seeing what he knew about the Old Testament, and getting him to try and prioritize from like 613 Mosaic laws. So this exchange, which you can read in Matthew 22, went something like this. One of the Pharisees, a lawyer, asked Jesus a question, testing him. "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" And Jesus said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbour as yourself. And on these two commandments depend the whole law and the prophets." So what is being said here? On the surface, love God. Love God with all your being, with your emotions, with your spiritual nature, with your faculty for reasoning comprehension. Turn all those things to God. And in a similar manner, love one another, feel one another, spiritually comprehend one another, intellectually discern one another, care for one another. Even this is a higher kind of love. It's not referring to normal tender affection or Hollywood love, nicey-nicey love, or romantic or familial love that most people think of. It's not that. I think Christ indicates more about this special love when he said, "Love one another as I have loved you," as chronicled by his friend John in John 13:34. So how did Christ love people? With a deep impulse to know them, with the innermost care, by opening himself, by sacrificing himself, by speaking the truth, by admonishing sinful behaviour, by exercising incredible discernment of the human condition, the mind, the spirit, the heart, the will. Christ loved through uplifting. He wanted the very best for us. He wanted us to choose for ourselves to embrace our ultimate ascendant destiny. This was Christ's love for mankind. It is certainly not love that tolerates everything and anything. Not that. Not the modern post-truth cultural love of immorality and perversion. It is not a love that sees no distinction between right and wrong. On the contrary, it is love that is just and righteous, because those things are necessary for spiritual transcendence. At the most fundamental level, if you truly love someone, you want to know all about them, comprehend them, appreciate them, feel them, consider them, look into their inner being, Love God. Love one another. For me, a chief characteristic of that love, of real love, is that you care to know. So when Christ said the most important thing in spiritual life is to love God and then to love one another, we can reasonably define that as care to know God, care to know one another. These are the foundation stones on which everything else is constructed. First and foremost, to love God, to know God, which is a lifetime's work, an ever-enriching pursuit and relationship. And secondly, to know each other, to love each other, which is also a devotional, lifelong, empathic practice. So if your spiritual practice is founded on caring to know God and caring to know one another, then you're in good shape. We might then ask ourselves, okay, how does someone actually do these things? What do people practically do in caring to know God, caring to know each other? What techniques and activities typify that? Well, to answer that, I would like to propose a further 2 practices. 2 things a person can choose to do that deepen one's understanding, appreciation, and love for God and mankind. We have 2 existing principles. Number 1, love God, care to know God. Number 2, love one another, care to know one another. So let me suggest number 3 and number 4, 2 scripturally warranted spiritual practices that provide us, I think, with keys to unlocking number 1 and number 2. And then we have a nice, neat, fourfold system of holy work. And as I mentioned the word scripture, let me clarify what that is. Scripture is different to normal writing in one key respect. It's a very important one, but one key respect. It is supernaturally, transcendentally, divinely inspired. It is written by the hands and hearts and minds of human beings. Yes, totally. But it is inspired spiritually by the Creator. It is not channeled work. It is not words dropping down from heaven onto the page like a matrix download from God. That is not how it happens. Divine inspiration works on a man's whole life to say exactly the right thing in a particular way on behalf of God that suits God's plans marvelously. That is the human mind and God's mind working in concert. It is a partnership. That's what inspiration is, a sacred collaboration. God doesn't want robots. He wants free-thinking people choosing truth, speaking truth, acting in truth, all of their own volition. Then, the spirit of inspiration can interfuse with them. That's one way of looking at inspiration. That's what we see in those canonical books of the Bible. So let's turn to our 3rd spiritual practice here, which we acquire gratefully from Psalm 1. Totally fascinating book, the Psalms, by the way. So much there, 150 very striking pieces of wisdom, prophecy and metaphysics and esoteric knowledge, all delivered in this lovely poetic form. Very brilliant. It takes a bit of decoding, I would say, but I tell you, they're dynamite, these Psalms. And psalm just means sacred song. And this grouping of psalms, sometimes collectively known as the Psalter with a P, Psalter, was written somewhere between 1500 BC and 500 BC. Precise dates are unknown for most of them, and they were authored by various different people, including David, Asaph, Korah, Solomon, Moses, and a bunch of other people, some of whom, as I say, are unknown. But David wrote the bulk of them, maybe about 73, maybe a few more. Asaph about 12 of them, Korah about 11 of them. So there are certainly groupings that concentrate around particular authors for sure. For now, we're going to look at Psalm 1. And I think it's not by accident that this crucial spiritual direction is found right there at the gateway of the whole Psalter. Let me read just the first 2 verses of it to you. The whole thing is only 6 verses, but we're going to examine the language a little bit. So for time's sake, we'll just look at the first 2 verses. And I'm reading from the New American Standard Bible, the 1995 translation. Psalm 1. How blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, nor stand in the path of sinners, nor sit in the seat of scoffers, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. So let me offer a very basic exposition and interpretation of those passages, because there's a lot going on there, even in that short space. Firstly, we are told about a state of blessedness. How blessed is the man? Line 1 begins. What is a state of blessedness or blessedness, depending on your pronunciation? Well, the word for blessed in Hebrew is the word esher, from the root word osher. Very similar but different. Theologians sometimes consider it to be this blessedness, a bit like a positive exclamation, expressing the positive state of a man who has devoted himself to God. The word itself, blessed, in English, in Webster's 1828, is defined rather beautifully as enjoying spiritual happiness and the favour of God, a form of heavenly felicity, skillful faculty. The root word, osher, infers straightness and advancement, to set right, to progress, which we know is only possible in alliance with God's Spirit. So we can infer supernatural relationship here. To be blessed is to be affirmed and assisted by God. Happy in knowing you are seen and supported. So the psalm tells us of this state of divine affirmation and assistance being enjoyed by someone who is not doing 3 negative things, first of all. How blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, nor stand in the path of sinners, nor sit in the seat of scoffers. How can we interpret those things in contemporary language? Firstly, the counsel of the wicked can be paralleled with the norms of pagan culture, the norms of modern mainstream life, the pronouncements of a society that is quite indifferent, quite unreceptive to God, quite hostile. The second part, the path of sinners, connotes active, knowing, deliberate transgression, I would say. Damaging, selfish behaviour. Always making excuses for everything and just going on living shambolically in a harmful way. Thirdly, there is the seat of scoffers. This is a reference to someone who is totally and contentedly resigned to their life of ungodliness, totally disparaging of the Creator and his holy project, comfortably sat down, reclining in their irreverent degradation. They not only reject the Creator, but they scorn his very nature and his whole spiritual enterprise. The British biblical commentator Adam Clarke, writing in the early 1800s, remarked about such a scoffer that he is utterly confirmed in impiety and mocks sin. His conscience is seared, and he is a believer in all unbelief. I like that. So you have 3 things here, 3 negative patterns to reject. Don't follow the ministrations of mainstream pagan culture. Don't try and quantify your destructive, immoral, ungodly behaviour. And don't resign your entire spiritual commission and live as an irreverent and profane scoffer. Don't do those things. So what does he do? What is the blessed man doing? What is he doing instead that aligns with God's grace and provision? His delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. So let's think about those 2 sentences for a moment. What is the law? That anyone should delight in it. What law is so fascinating and good and valuable and juicy that we should gain pleasure from focusing on it all the time? The term law represents the Word of God. That is, the instructions, doctrines, and precepts that he has communicated to us. His godly teaching, his will, that has been revealed by himself. The word law is taken from the Hebrew word Torah, which means instruction, direction, a body of holy knowledge, prophetic teaching, priestly direction, living wisdom. The word Torah itself derives from a root Hebrew word, yara, Y-A-R-A, which means taught, given outward, pointed out like an arrow shot, authoritative instruction, something poured outward. So the picture painted is one of a man who decides to focus his time and energy on the nature and teaching of the divine creator, looking into that which God himself lovingly pours outwards. Where is God's word? Where can we find his teaching and instructions? In God himself, in the Bible, in his unique manifestation as a man, now ascended as a divine man, Christ, in his emanating spirit, and also in the hearts and minds of wise disciples of God. Because God's word is a living philosophy that is conveyed throughout the creation. It is alive in the mountains and rivers. It's in the stars and the sun and the moon every day, in the clouds and the ocean. It's in the grain patterns in wood. It's in the spirals of seashells. It's in the sound of rain falling. Nature, the natural world, is not just a lovely aesthetic backdrop to life. It's not just something nice to look at like on a movie set. It is a living metaphor that vividly corresponds to God's teachings. So the law is God's will. It is found in his presence and being. It is in the Bible. It is in the natural world. It appears in our dreams every night. It can arise in our deep conversations with our friends, when spirit is absolutely present with us. It is in our nighttime prayers and our contemplative silence. This holy law of God, this living, emanating word, is an astonishing thing. Which leads us to our word, meditate. His delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. Or in the ESV and NKJV translation, it says, on his law he meditates day and night. No matter, small but subtle translation differences, both are good. On his law, in his law. The point is that one's reflections on God's presence, his nature, his teaching, and his living word are woven throughout the day. Webster defines meditate as to dwell on something in thought, to contemplate, to study, to turn or revolve any subject in the mind. It's nothing to do with zoning out or emptying your mind while sat on a cushion. That sort of Eastern definition of meditation is not what we mean here. The meditation we're talking about is, in fact, the traditional meaning of the word, meaning directing the focus of the mind upon a given subject, usually at length. Certainly, with the text element of meditating on God's teachings, there's a lot of stuff to look at. There's a lot to dig into. You will never ever run out of things to read. Primarily, of course, there is the Bible, 66 little books collected together in this one big volume, which in itself is a life's work to understand and properly appreciate. It's a pleasure to do so. Knowing how to read it, getting help to interpret it and study it, developing the skills and tools and methods to do it yourself. And as we mentioned in the last Roamcast, there are other very important spiritual documents one would be very ill-advised to ignore. The pseudepigrapha, the apocrypha, credible monastic writings, credible mystical writings, and many mature theological writings, old and new. So yes, there's quite a bit to look at. Not too much, but certainly not too little. I like to say with this body of literature that you could just about hold it in your arms, like one big pile of books in your arms. The sincere student of divinity does not just read to fill his head up with knowledge. he reflects carefully and unhurriedly on what he has read. The reading, the study, and the contemplation go together. Even to read one little passage, to really think about it. Just recently, I was reading Paul's first letter to the tumultuous spiritual community in Corinth in Greece, where he's writing in 1 Corinthians 13, 1 and 2, where he says, "If I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but do not have love, I have become a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and know all mysteries and all knowledge, and I have all faith with which I could move mountains, but if I do not have love, I am nothing." And I read this and it just took my breath away. One of the cleverest, most devoted men of the New Testament period places the principle of love, the same one we spoke of earlier, above all the fancy knowledge, above all the celestial angelic languages, above all precognitive dreams, above all prophetic seeing, above all the cosmic transmutations and divine wisdom, above and before all that, for him, is love. I just read his words and contemplated them. And I think honestly, that's most of the work. The meditation, the contemplation. You imbibe a principle, then you go off and contemplate it at length. Watch the clouds drift over, listen to the rain, listen to the wind in the eaves of your house, and think. Feel the pulsation of wisdom in life. Morning, noon, and night. It is a pleasure to reflect on truth and divinity, to read about it, to talk about it, to write about it, to examine all the doctrines that God has shared with us, what Christ said, what his apostles said, what wise men said, what the angels said, what prophecy says, what the historical timeline says, what the overarching metaphysical philosophy says. We are free and able to look at those things all the time, if you like. And personally, I can think of nothing more remarkable, more satisfying. Nothing. I am happy and honoured to make time in my life to think about these things. I feel blessed. So this is our number 3 piece of spiritual work. Love the Word. Study God's teaching, his law, his guidance. Love God, love one another, love the Word. Finally, let's come to number 4 in our fourfold spiritual structure here. And for this one, we turn to Genesis 2 and 3 to mine its spiritual gold. And honestly, I'm just going to provide the merest outline sketch here. Otherwise, we'd need another 10 hours. So for now, we'll just look at the essentials. And in Genesis 2, we read this: "Out of the ground the Lord God caused to grow every tree that is pleasing to the sight and good for food, the tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil." And we're going to skip down a few verses now. "Then the Lord God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden to cultivate it and keep it. The Lord God commanded the man, saying, 'From any tree of the garden you may eat freely, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For in the day that you eat from it, surely you will die.'" And as we've noted before here, the trees may be literal or figurative. There's a case for both, but we won't know one way or the other until, like many things, afterwards, after we leave this world. But the principle of what they represent is what matters most here, right now. And following on from these verses in Genesis 2, I think we all know the portentous happenings that unfold from there onwards. But still, let's look at the basic text again for a moment, just to remind ourselves of the actual events that unfold. So I'm going to turn to Genesis chapter 3 and read through verses 1 to 7. Now the serpent was more crafty than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, Indeed, has God said, You shall not eat from any tree of the garden? And the woman said to the serpent, From the fruit of the trees of the garden we may eat, but from the fruit of the tree which is in the middle of the garden, God has said, You shall not eat from it, or touch it, or you will die. The serpent said to the woman, You surely will not die, for God knows that in the day you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. When the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable to make one wise, she took from its fruit and ate. And she gave also to her husband with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loin coverings. What a chain of events there, goodness me. This lot is responsible for much of our strange predicament in life. A fallen spirit being, which you could call a fallen angel for shorthand, tempts the woman to disobey God and place her own will above his. And, like the fallen angel himself did, she does just that, which everyone knows is not a good idea, but she does it anyway. And then Adam does it too. All three of them do something extremely unwise. Some theologians remark that when God is reproaching all these three characters shortly afterwards, he deals with them in order of the magnitude of their sin. The satanic serpent spirit is dealt with first, and the most severely. Then the woman, then the man. That is a controversial matter, debatable what's going on there exactly, though we can securely say that all three of them acted against God, with varying degrees of disobedience. And I have to say, it does seem to me that the most dreadful and nefarious crime was on the part of the satanic serpent spirit, who, in a calculating and premeditated fashion, set out to damage mankind and mankind's relationship with God, through deceiving the first man and the first woman, to mislead, to coax them into being recalcitrant and undiscerning, which they were, and were subsequently ejected from the protected higher space of Eden for their own spiritual welfare, as we later come to see, and of course in the meantime descend into a decaying, fallen land. And all the natural flora and fauna, they are subject to the fallenness too. Predation, hostility, darkness, everything on earth is subject to that. And so, here we all are, dwelling in this totally unnatural state of separation and suffering and corrosion. Quite a pickle. However, something else, something fascinating, is also happening in the events of Genesis 2 and 3. Something that helps to crystallize our fourth precept. A particular tree is there in Eden, a tree which provides the opportunity to know good and evil. Or if you want to couch it in strict theological terms, knowledge of that which aligns with God's will and knowledge of that which does not. Goodness always corresponds with God's will. Evil always inverts God's will. Because God is goodness and righteousness and truth. He is both the creator and the perfect embodiment of these qualities. Any move away from God's will automatically and immediately begins a process of degradation, a deterioration immediately, a disinclination towards truth, no appetite for divinity, and a powerful gravitation towards stories. And the further away someone places themselves from God, the more someone denies all that, opposes all that, the more severe their moral and spiritual descent. In many cases, irrecoverable. Knowledge of good and evil is a sacred thing, treasured among God's spirit-being family. The thrones, the seraphim, the cherubim, the dominions, the powers, the authorities, the archangels, the angels, whole strata of our older good spirit brothers. who, like us, were endowed with the transcendent ability of free will. And they chose wisely the good. Yes, the angels know about good and evil, and they chose. They chose the good. The fallen, that's another matter. We'll come to that in due course. For now, we are focusing on the tree. And I suspect that within the Edenic realm, way back, God had a whole host of ways of teaching us about good and evil. Fantastic systems of tutelage and instruction to be absorbed in harmony with him, alongside him, in accord with him. That is, if we demonstrated observance and obedience of his will. Because his will is goodness, is truth, do you see? But we didn't. We went against his will and chose another way via the tree. God both granted our request to have the knowledge of good and evil, which we quickly had, and at the same time he also rescued us from death by incarnating as Christ. And as Christ overcame death, we too share in that resurrection and ascendancy if we choose goodness, if we care to discern right from wrong, choose truth and reject falsehood, if. And then at last, we finally come to our home world that God had in mind for us from the very beginning. But for the moment, whilst we are here, marooned on this sad theatrical crumbling island, our education is accomplished the hard way, need I tell you. Why? Because we are separated from God, temporarily. He is not separated from us, not in his daily experience, but we are from him. And still, we are not always in harmony with his will, still today, which is what we're learning to do here. Align with his will, to care, to know, to learn, to embody, to refine the process of discernment. And such is God's ceaseless love for us, that he provides everything necessary for us to distill and distinguish whatever we may. Everything necessary to witness the evil and learn from it, to witness the good, of course, and learn from it, to choose. Good and evil, unavoidably, all around us all the time. The good is obvious, isn't it? The evil is obvious, isn't it? Even though the counsel of the wicked, that is the consensus of mainstream culture, is trying to persuade you to classify evil as good, trying to repackage immorality, perversion, and murder as modern relativism. Love is love, reproductive rights, calling Christianity hate speech. Obvious, absurd inversions like that. Inversion is the hallmark of satanic alignment. Whether people know it or not, doesn't matter. They are aligning themselves with the chief agent of evil when they swallow and uphold these, what can we say, empire's socio-political inversions. Shame on anyone who does that. Shame. Be a good idea to stop, have the courage to look at it completely differently, to have a transformation inside heart and mind. The Greeks have a word for that, metanoia, which, when rendered into an English Bible, is read as the word repentance. Tell the truth and live a genuine countercultural spiritual life. Don't be a little demonic repeater. Discernment solves these problems. Exercising discernment is a big deal in the fallen world. Truth and falsehood right under your nose every single day, right and wrong around every corner, and transmitted to hearts and minds and on the screens and the pages and the radio waves, in the school curricula, in hospitals, in the government, everywhere. The point is, are you ready? Are you willing? Are you able to discern? To acknowledge the existence of good and evil? Because God requires you to do that. So we can say, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil provides our fourth spiritual practice, discernment. We now have our 4 precepts, a quatrain of practices, a biblical fourfold spiritual walk. Love God, love one another, love the Word, love discernment. Care to know God, care to know one another, care to know God's living teaching, care to know the practice of discerning good and evil. I like this formulation. I think it works. It illuminates, it cultivates divine relationship. It keeps your eye on the ball. It fosters humility. It reorients. It helps you connect with good people. And I'm sure the nuances and details will change and develop and everything over time, but I get the feeling that the underlying foundations are solid. And most importantly of all, I have a great deal of confidence in the credibility of the sources of these four principles. Christ himself for number 1 and number 2, an inspired psalmist for number 3, and the account of Moses for the events of Genesis for our 4th point. You know, that represents pretty sound biblical warrant. Wisdom from the lives of real people who've walked this earth like you and me. In real life, in the history of this very world. Thinking, loving, redeeming. I've been practicing these 4 things for a little while now, and personally I would say they definitely help me to focus my spiritual life in a much more coherent way. I think I'm spending time on the most important things. And I'm not wasting time on trivialities as much. Or as one ancient schoolmistress of mine used to say, I'm not messing about with fiddle-faddle. There's a term you don't hear very often anymore. I bet no one under 50 says that, do they? I also note that I have not lost anything in this work of loving God, loving one another, loving the Word, loving discernment. Nothing truly important in my life, nothing precious, has been left by the wayside. And to look at it from another angle, some super valuable old things from early life have not only been preserved, they have been lifted to new heights, which I'll tell you more about in a minute. When I was a little kid, I could tell God was there. The presence of God was the most natural thing in the world to me. I imagined he was kind of gently hovering above everything like a kind guardian, and he could see everything and be part of everything. He was holding it all together, and he could be right with you if he wanted to, in the blink of an eye. And of course my little mind couldn't grasp the concepts of deific omnipresence or omniscience or anything like that. But I reckon that God was just really big and floated down at times like a big happy sky and enfolded us all in his self, in his love and his care. And it all seems very sweet and sentimental now to talk like that. I don't mean to be, cute about it, but that's what I felt at the time as a child, a little child. Even in those first few years of life, I knew God was there. He was with us all the time. And I also felt that all the people in the world were somehow all very important to God, and that he was helping us all to do something, giving us the opportunity of something very splendid and valuable. And again, I didn't have a clue what that was exactly, I don't know. Perhaps I thought it was just to be alive, just to smile and play, just to have a nice dinner, just to have a mum and dad, and a bedroom and a blue bicycle. I think knowing God is innate. I know that knowing God is innate. The Bible says it in many places, and I know from working with hundreds of students over the years, perhaps 1,000 or 2, I know that they feel it too. The wisest men and women I've met, they feel it too. Even the ones who didn't want to. Knowing God is baked into us. I also felt as a child, with my unseasoned yet uncorrupted heart, I felt that somehow my soul was safe because of God. And no matter what twists and turns life might bring, whatever delights and dread, because I am with him and because he's with me, everything's okay. So thinking back all those years ago, this primitive yet sincere relationship of a child with God was quite natural. Natural. And I didn't grow up in a religious home by any means. It was essentially secular, though thank God, my mum and dad had both grown up with Christian principles in their lives, which was good. But there was no substantial Christian practice in our lives together at that time that I can remember. I don't remember ever studying the Bible, and no formal church attendance, and no Sunday school, no big discussion about God, nothing like that. Though there were some basic prayers at night, there was natural valuing of morality and honesty and such like, for sure, for which I'm very grateful to my mum and dad. You know, although these are apparently the most rudimentary of things, they're just not to be taken for granted these days. When you think about the horror of many kids' lives because of abusive, neglectful, terrible parents, terrible schools, I'm just so appreciative for the good things in my childhood. And a bit later, as a kid, I went to a quaint little Church of England primary school in Cheshire, in England, of course. And it's known as a Church of England school, a C of E school. It's part of the Anglican Christian tradition in the UK, with some features of the Reformed Church and some remnants of Catholic traditions, and it was okay. Certainly in terms of formative schooling, it was all right. The education in reading and writing and maths and geography and history and nature and all that was fine. And the faded perimeter of traditional Christian observances were all just about still present. We said the Lord's Prayer, we sang hymns, we did nativity things at Christmas, we heard a little bit of talk about Jesus, little things like that, though we didn't understand it very well, and it wasn't a major focus. But nevertheless, we got the sense that something good and something supernatural was happening in the world. A sense which was expeditiously uprooted and cast aside in the first year of high school, about the age of 12 or 13 or whatever. The callous imperial curriculum of careers and science and technology and European socialism just totally took over. God was gone, and all divinity and all supernature just vanished, disappeared, as if none of it had ever happened, or it was just a silly story. And I remember various high school teachers sneering at it all. And the one religious studies teacher we did have, a rather melancholic butch woman, sadly she didn't really help to redress the balance very much. We'll just leave it at that. And overall, by the onset of teenage years, we were all unquestionably trained to uninstall God. Thank God, it never quite worked with some of us, including me. I knew some unthinkably elevated divine intelligence was orchestrating all the theatrical physics of the world, and all of life, somehow, was a pilgrimage. The light and dark, the rain and shine, all part of the education. Thank God for not letting my brains evaporate altogether. So this fourfold spiritual work that we're outlining here takes that innate sense of divinity and lifts it. That's what it's for. It acknowledges the pilgrimage and offers spiritual gifts and spiritual alliance along the way. If we wish to accept God's invitation to divine family, if we do that, our old self is heated, volatilized, disturbed. And in the process, truth is separated from untruth, fact from fiction, virtue from sin. Love God, love one another, love the word, love discernment. Very simple. And yet, spending a few moments on it as we have done, you begin to see how much is contained in these few words. That's why I wanted to spend a little time looking at it with you. And if you're a Christian, you probably already know a lot of this stuff, but I hope you'll still find something different and helpful too. If you're quite new to all this and perhaps just tentatively exploring real historic Christianity for the first time, well, again, I hope this recording gives you something challenging and meaningful to think about. I hope you'll now go off and research and delve and ponder. So much spicy theological goodness to get into. Spiritual work need not be obscure and complex. It can be clear and simple, with a focus on the Creator, on one another, on the Creator's revealed teachings, and on refining our skill of discernment. And in these things you have the most fascinating and significant work of all time at your fingertips. And you don't need any special equipment to do it. No secret techniques. You just have to make space and time in your life. You have to decide it's worthwhile. Put it this way, God thinks you're worth it. God thinks you're worth his time and effort and attention and love. You just have to ask yourself, is he worth yours?
We hope you enjoyed listening to this Roamcast. Neil Kramer loves you. You heard clips from the following. Dialogue from the 1960s British TV show, Danger Man. The song, Nuance, by Fortidelis. The song, Foundation, by Fortidelis. Both shared under a Creative Commons license. If you liked any of those clips, support the artists and go buy their stuff. That's all for now. See you again soon. Until then, we wish you a beautiful day.
Nehmen Sie auch gerne der Google Maps und am Display vor Ihnen auf Ihren Bildschirm mit viel weiteren Details. Ihnen erstmal einen angenehmen Aufenthalt bei uns hier an Bord. Ich wünsche Ihnen auch eine gute Nacht und ich melde mich dann morgen bei Ihnen mit aktuellen Wetterinformationen und zum Anflug auf Frankfurt. Vielen Dank. Ladies and gentlemen, warm welcome from the flight deck. I'm your first officer. I have the pleasure to fly towards Frankfurt away, and I do have some information about our trip and the routing and so on. Yeah, we took off on time in Seattle with Southern on runway 16, did a left-hand turn. I'm now already in the Canadian airspace overhead the Rocky Mountains, and we're heading towards Calgary. Later on we will fly towards the Hudson Bay. We'll pass the town of Churchill, well known for the high ice bear population in that area. And then further towards, like I said, crossing the Hudson Bay towards Greenland, and later on over Iceland, Ireland, past the western coast of Norway, and then with a fairly southern heading via Denmark, Hamburg, and over towards Frankfurt. Due to the strong tailwinds that we are encountering today, we'll be on time, fairly well before the planned arrival time. Right now we are 45 minutes ahead of schedule. Sometimes when you're too early, the parking position might be blocked, so we'll might wait a little in Frankfurt, but nevertheless we'll be well ahead of the schedule. Yeah, the flight so far, so supposed to be smooth. We're flying above the tropopause. Weather's all going to be below us. Weather in Frankfurt is reported to be beautiful. I give you the latest information tomorrow morning. Yeah, for right now, all the information I just mentioned and some more details are on the screen ahead of you on the moving map. And yeah, wish you a pleasant stay here on board. Have a good night. Get some rest and some sleep. Enjoy the food, and I'll get back to you tomorrow morning with information and about the weather of Frankfurt. Alright, thank you guys. See you later.
Hey guys, thank you very much for choosing Austrian Starlines today. On behalf of the entire crew, I would like to say goodbye to now. We wish you a very nice remaining day here in Vienna. Rest safe and safe on your journey. Goodbye und auf Wiedersehen.